1519, Veracruz, this guy named Hernan Cortez. He was a commander of a ship, and he was commanding not only his ship, but 10 others, so a total of 11 ships and some 550 men. And they landed in Mexico. And as you can expect, when they landed, they were greeted by the indigenous people. But when you start to look at his mission, you understand that he took some 550 soldiers and men there, but they were greeted by 5 million plus indigenous people. If you're good at math, that's roughly a 7,500 to 1 ratio, a little more than 7,500 to 1 ratio. For every one soldier, there's about 7,500 indigenous people. So how did Hernan Cortez eventually win over the land, eventually take over this spot in Mexico? If you read the story, what's very intriguing is Hernan, the first thing that he does once he lands there and once his men get off the boats, he commands them to totally empty the boats and then to burn the ships. So think about that real quick. You land at this new place. You're outnumbered, drastically outnumbered. And your commander looks at you and says, take everything off of it. Don't leave anything behind. We're burning the ships. That's right. We're burning our only way out. This means that this is an all or nothing mission. It's a place and a moment in your life where retreat, going back, is not an option. This is a story about a bold decision that was made for each of them. It was a bold decision that Hernan made, and every day since then, they had to live in that decision. And they had to make decisions that follow suit with that bold decision. And I think that we can learn a little bit about that. I think that we can learn a little bit about Hernan Cortez leadership mentality, and maybe what does that mean for us in our faith even. See, his mindset was simple yet so profound and bold. Failure is not an option. Retreat, going back, is not an option. We will only go forward. We either succeed or we're going to die trying. It's all or nothing. And what's crazy is if you look at this, that meant they couldn't just store anything on the ship and go back for it. They couldn't hold something for later. It was all or nothing. And sometimes I truly wonder if we look at our faith and our attitude in life maybe in the same way. Like, what if we truly looked at how we walk and live with God the same way that Hernan had a leadership mentality and attitude? That going backwards is not an option. We're only going to go forward, and we're only going to walk in that. Like, what if when we meet God and have this true experience with God, what if in those moments God asks us to burn the ships? Like, what if we burn the ships of our past lives and we totally sell out to his plan and his will for us in our own lives? What if we truly burn those ships? When we get off and we meet him and he looks at us and he says, unload everything right here, right now. Don't hold anything back. And we take everything off. We take off our baggage and we take off everything and we're standing on the shore with him. And he looks at us and then he says, now let's burn the ship of your past failures and even your past successes. Let's burn the ships of your bad habits and burn the ships of your regrets. Let's burn the ships of guilt that you've been carrying. And let's burn the ships of your old way of life. We're not going to go back. Let's go forward together. What if we truly believe that God and his plan A, was Jesus coming and saving us. And that was his only plan. There's no plan B. There's no way out. There's no retreat. There's no going back to how we used to live. It's simply put, we're going to burn the ships and we're going to go all in to follow God. Like, I truly believe that God had plan A in mind. And plan A is his people. It was his son. It was us to go and bring the news to the world. And that's his plan A. And he doesn't need a plan B. Now, I mean, I think for us that means that we have to be willing to go into sacrifice. We have to be willing to burn the ships and watch them burn to nothing on the open seas, to literally go and to walk with God daily. And walking with God daily means that we must lose everything we've gained up into this point, and we have to do that daily. Remember, we talked about God calls us to pick up our cross and to follow him, and he calls us to do that daily. That means that every single day, everything we've worked for, everything we've gained up until that very moment, we have to put it down, we have to leave it behind and pick up the cross again and follow him. We live in a culture, though, that keeps all of our options and other things open. We live in a world that says, well, make sure you have a plan A, B, C, D, E, and even F. And so when God calls us to burn the ships of our past ways, of our bad habits, of our guilt, of our old ways of living, it's countercultural. It doesn't make sense to the world to do what Christ calls us to do. But what I love about Jesus and what I love about God is that God and Jesus never ask us to do something that they have not already done or are willing to do themselves. When Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me, he did the exact same thing. He picked up the physical cross. So when he asks us to do it, he's already been there. He's already done that. And I think so often in our lives, I think we like the comfort of plans B, C, D, E, and F, because it brings us this idea that, well, when plan A gets too risky or too difficult, too hard, I'll just go to my other plans because those are going to be easier. We like the options because it's comfortable. And we've talked a lot about being comfortable in this series and what that means and how God calls us out of the comfort. He calls us to do what nobody else is doing, to do what he is asking us to do, to be countercultural. He calls us to run a race that it doesn't make sense for our world. And our world says, just indulge in yourself. And God says, indulge in me. Take part in me. And I think so often when God calls us to be countercultural, it doesn't make sense to the world because they don't and they can't see his bigger picture maybe. There's a guy, most of us know this man. He's a great guy. His name is Noah. And this is what it says in Hebrews 11:7. This is one verse that I want to share and talk a little bit about Noah here. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. But his faith, and by his faith, he condemned the world and became heir to the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. Now, let's talk about Noah. You see, Hebrews 11 is this chapter in the Bible which is known as kind of like the Hall of Fame of faith. And if you go and read it, you read about all these men and women who had great faith, and they're now in like this Hall of Fame, essentially, of faith. And we can look at them and see what great faith they had and model even how we believe and walk with God after what they did as well. In Noah, we get a glimpse in this one verse, we get a glimpse of what made Noah so great. It was his faith and his obedience, his faith in God and what God spoke to him, and his obedience to it even when it didn't make sense. Noah gets this call, and God calls him to build an ark. Now, Noah's ark is one of the longest and largest construction projects ever recorded. It took Noah a while to build the ark. And not only that, But I think what is so crazy is when you start to look at what Noah did in the midst of everything that was happening in those times, it shows great obedience, but it shows great faith. And faith involves obedience in the face of the unseen. Faith, our faith in God, involves obedience to him and his word in the face of the things that are unseen in our world, in our lives, in our culture. Think about it. God calls Noah to build an ark. Now, this is a big boat, and God says there's going to be a flood. And so Noah goes, and you imagine this conversation, right, of like, God, you want me to build a big boat. You know, like it hasn't really been all that like great for water skiing and wakeboarding lately. And God's like, I know, but it's coming. So here Noah is, gets this call. God calls him to build an ark. And he does so in a time that a flood has never happened before, but Noah has faith. The dimensions of the ark is rather large, 330 cubits long by 50 wide by 30 high. And if you do some of the math, it roughly comes out to the ark being the size of 1.5 football fields, give or take. And here's what's so intriguing to me. As I started to dig into Noah and to listen to just some different commentaries and theologians and scholars about Noah, here's what is so intriguing to me is how Noah showed us what long obedience looks like and what life obedience looks like. I think oftentimes when we grew up and we heard the story of Noah's Ark, it's like, oh man, like Noah builds this big boat and the animals come and he, hangs out on the boat for a little bit and then all is good. And I think for some odd reason we have this mentality that like it was this thing of like Noah got this, God calls Noah to do it and Noah goes and he starts building and a few days later he builds this ark and the animals just naturally come and then all of a sudden they're on the water and then that's going to end and everything's great. But when you start to understand this about the Jewish tradition, what the Jewish tradition talks about Noah and his faith and his obedience, the Jewish tradition says that before Noah even built the ark, he went and planted trees and he nurtured them and he grew them. So as Noah is walking in obedience to what God has called him to do, Noah goes and plants seeds of trees to grow them. The Jewish tradition says that he would plant them and nurture them and grow them, then cut them down, saw them into planks, and use them to build his ark. I don't know about you, but for me, trees take a while to grow. And that meant that Noah had this dedication to what God was calling him to do in his life, not just in a moment. He built the ark through a life dedication to God's call on his life. This act of obedience is one of the greatest recorded in the Word. It's one of the longest acts of obedience in the Word of God. Some almost 44,000 days of obedience comes out of Noah. Let's also not forget that not only has a flood not happened, but he's building this ark in the middle of a desert. See, Noah building the ark is a great model of not just obedience and dedication and great faith in God, but true worship of God as well. And it leads me to ask maybe us sitting at home today of, well, how do we worship through our own obedience? How are we worshiping? And for some of us, that might mean that swinging a hammer is worship. Building is worship for some of us. That is a way that we use our God-given talents and gifts to glorify God. We build things with our hands. We're gifted that way. For some of us, that might mean that we are gifted to paint things. It might be a painting on a canvas, or it might be painting a whole entire business or house. But God has given you the talent and the skills and the mindset and the eyes to paint, all for his glory of God. For others of us, like Josh, singing Playing musical instruments is worship. He can glorify God in how he sings and worship, and he's gifted that way to help us and facilitate us in worship and help walk us into a deeper presence of God. And for others, it might be teaching or preaching, or maybe for some of us, we can make the very best coffee and coffee cake. Baking, cooking is worship. Drawing is worship. Helping, serving, loving, all is worship. And I truly believe that following the call on our lives that God puts on us is worship. MLK, an incredible man says this. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as if it was a Michelangelo painting, or even as if Beethoven himself was composing music or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep the streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. Are we living and walking in obedience with how we worship and live our lives? Are we showing great faith in what God has given us and called us to do with how we are living and going about our daily lives? And what's so crazy is that we read and we know these stories of these great men and women of faith and their obedience and their surrender to his call on their lives. We remember them, we talk about them, we share them with our kids, we teach about them. And I think one guy who is incredible that maybe doesn't get talked about, and maybe for some of us, we don't even know this name, is a dude, his name is Shamgar. And it's a story in the Old Testament. This story is found in Judges chapter 3, and it's very short. It's literally 3:31, and it comes after all of this, and Shamgar, this is what it says about Shamgar. It's one verse. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And he too saved Israel. That's it. That's what we know. After Ehud came Shamgar, and he took down all these Philistines, and he saved Israel. But here's what's so interesting to me about Shamgar. Shamgar was not an Israelite. So think about it. Here he is. These are not his people that he saves. He strikes down Philistines. He saves Israel, and he himself is not an Israelite. Yet Shamgar did what was asked of him and was called of him. He didn't look for a way out. He didn't look for an excuse. He didn't look for a way to say, nah, I'm good, God. No, he just walked in what God was asking and telling him to do. The reality that I think we can learn from Shamgar is this. If you look for an excuse, you'll find one. If you look for an excuse, you'll find one. If you look for an excuse to not do what God has called you or asked you to do, I'm positive you can find one. If you look for an excuse to get out of a relationship and something that God is calling you to have and go into, I'm sure you can find one. If you look for an excuse, you will find one. Shamgar could have and had a valid excuse. These aren't my people. He could have lived in that excuse of why should I save the people that are not my own? But instead, Shamgar trusted and sold out to be all in for God's glory, to trust God in it all. I know one of the main excuses that sometimes I've used in my life is this excuse of, well, I'm not qualified for that. I'm not good enough for that. I don't have what it takes for that. And if I'm being very honest with you, it's actually a deep, deep fear of not being good enough, not being worthy enough. And I know you've probably heard this, of this statement, this quote of, well, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And I believe that's true. I truly do. I remember when my first few weeks here and even leading up to taking this taking over the church here, I truly did not feel qualified. I did not feel gifted enough. I didn't feel like I had the tools and the talents to do what it takes to actually run a church. But what's so evident to me was I was relying on my own strength. I was relying on my own mentality and gifts. Because the reality is this is on my own, I don't. On my own, I don't have what it takes. But through the power and the gifts of the Spirit and the power and the gifts of the blood of Christ, I can do this. But it's only through Him and through His power. You see, I believe our faith in God calls us to tap into that, to lean into that, and to know that on our own, we don't have what it takes sometimes. But through His Spirit, through His power, through His Son, He has made it possible for us to accomplish the impossible. Faith requires and demands a devotion to the long haul. Faith requires a devotion to long-term commitments, to the long obedience in the same direction. If you're driving somewhere, you understand that it might take you on a highway somewhere. And it might say, stay on this highway for 300 some odd miles. That's a long time. But if you're heading in the same direction and you stay on the same path and you're committed to following the GPS where it's telling you, you'll get to your final destination. It's the same thing for our faith. We have to have this long commitment and faith and devotion to His call and His love in our lives to walk with Him. And we will end up in the final destination in the presence of God, in the glory of the heavens, and all of the heavens and the earth will praise His name. But in order to get there, we have to be devoted to what He is calling us to do and how He is calling us to live. We might not feel adequate or equipped or ready to do what God has called us to do. But that's His job to equip us, to build us up, and to prepare us for it. I'm sure David, when he took over, didn't feel worthy enough and skilled enough and ready to lead. But God prepared him for that. Prepared him in watching over the sheep, protecting the sheep. He prepared him in the field when nobody else is watching. And maybe, just maybe, God's doing the same thing for you. Maybe, just maybe, as you are walking in devotion and commitment to Him and how He's called you to live your life, maybe He's preparing you for the next step, and you just don't see it yet. We talk about all these men who are legends, right? Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Samuel, David, Isaiah. And at the end of the day, what do all of these men have in common? I think all these men reflect the words that were spoken in Isaiah 6:8, where he's standing there and he's hearing, well, who shall I send? And Isaiah speaks up, here I am, Lord. Here I am. Send me. And I believe that all these men of great faith and these women of great faith have this moment where, whether they verbally speak it or not, or it's internal, here I am. I'll do it. Send me. They lived with a readiness to respond in life. What if we lived with the same attitude in our prayer lives, in our regular lives, that say, here I am, use me, I'm ready. Whatever you call me to do, I will go. And oftentimes, I think as we get ready for that, and in those moments, we might say, here I am, send me, and then it gets revealed, and it's this mountain that is before us. And we look at it and we're like, how in the world am I going to climb this mountain? This is impossible. How are we going to do this? And that question, right, of, well, how do I get to the top? What if I told you getting to the top of the mountain is very simple, actually? It's very simple. You get to the top one step at a time. Plain simple. I think that's simply what God asks us to do, is just take one step with Him at a time. We might not feel ready to take the next step, but God might know we are. So let's have faith and trust Him in that. Or maybe we don't feel adequate yet, but God knows that there's something deep down inside of us that's going to rise up to the surface, going to bubble up to the surface. And when it bubbles up, we will understand the greatness that He has put inside of us. I'm often reminded in these moments that there's these defining moments, these steps that we grow bigger and we move further than we've ever been before. And I'm reminded that it's true for all of us. And hear me on this. In life, I think we make large defining decisions. We make these large defining decisions. You might make a defining decision to lose weight and be healthier. You make a defining decision to run a marathon. A defining decision to grow more in your faith. Those are defining decisions. They are big decisions. I want to lose X amount of pounds this year. Defining decision. Why? Why do I want to do? Well, I'm going to be healthier. I'm going to be like all my cholesterol and all that stuff is going to be better. My body will thank me for that. I'm going to lose weight this year. Defining decision, defining moment, and we want to achieve it. It's our ultimate goal. But how do you get there? Well, you achieve the defining decisions through daily decisions and devotion. You achieve the defining decision by making daily decisions and daily devotion to accomplish it. Defining decision. I want to lose weight. My daily decision maybe is I'm going to watch what I eat and I'm going to exercise more. Defining decision. I'm going to run a marathon by the end of this year. My daily decision, I'm going to run every single day and build up until I'm able to run that marathon. Defining decision, I'm going to grow in my faith spiritually. I'm going to have a daily decision and devotion to being in the Word, to pray in daily, and to spend time with Him. Our defining decisions and our daily decisions and devotion go hand in hand. And when we have the attitude of, here I am, send me, those are defining decisions that God asks us to do something. A defining moment, a defining faith moment. And we have to make a daily devotion and decision to walk into that and achieve it. In Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 3, this is what it reads. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, and consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and you will not lose heart. What does the devotion look like to run the race and to strip off things that hold us back? What does that devotion look like? Let's also not forget that sometimes we can go a lot further walking with him than trying to run ahead of what he has prepared for us. We're called to run this race. I remember back in October when a good portion of us ran the half marathon or full marathon here in Grand Rapids. And training for that and the day of the marathon, I remember running it. And there came a point in our run where, for me, we had to just walk a little bit. I could have just stopped. I could have just stopped moving and rested in that moment and not moved an inch. But instead, I continued to walk. What if as you're running the race and you're stripping off all the stuff that hinders you, all the sin and the baggage and the brokenness, and as you're running, you might feel like you can't go another inch running. So what if you walk with him in those moments? It's not saying that your faith, it's not saying that your love and your devotion for him is less in those moments. It's saying you're still trusting his call. It's saying you're still trusting his presence and his power in your life. You just need to walk. I think so oftentimes we try to run on ahead of God. We get this moment in our lives and we might see this defining thing, but we don't run how he has called us to run, or we don't go at the pace he has designed for us. And we maybe try to go ahead of him. And what happens, at least for me, if I try to go ahead of God, is I mess something up because I'm relying on my own self, not him anymore. And when I rely on my own self, it usually doesn't work out. I think our faith in him is more like a marathon. It's not a sprint. Faith is a dedication. It's a devotion. It's not a thing that seeks 15 minutes of fame, but rather we seek eternal glory. Our faith should not care about the public opinion, but rather we should live for the applause of the nailed, scarred hands. Who cares what the world says when we get the applause and we get to stand before the God of the universe, the God who spoke everything into existence, and Jesus stands there with his pierced hands and pierced side and his feet in the crown, and he looks at us and all he says is, well done. Well done. Our faith should not be satisfied with the world has to offer, but rather, the only objective is my utmost for his highest. What if we lived a life of that? Like, what if we lived our very best to have faith and devotion like those who have gone before us, and to run this race that he has set out for us at the pace he has set out for us and outlined us? And maybe for some of us today, maybe, just maybe is a moment today that you need to pause. And maybe you need to burn the ships of your past. Maybe you've never committed your life to Jesus. Or maybe you've lived kind of on this teeter-totter of living and not living for him, and living for him and not living for him. And maybe today is a day where you need to light the match and burn the ships of your past again and say, I'm done. I can't go back. Because maybe you've been living this life for Jesus, but the whole time you've had that ship of your old habits and your old ways of life tied up on the dock. And maybe today you need to just pour gasoline on that ship and light the match and toss it on and say, I am not going to go back to that. I have no other option. I will only walk with him. And today, if that's you, if you need to rededicate today, if you want to ask Jesus into your life for your first time, the good news is you can. He's present. He's sitting right next to you. He's tangibly in front of you right now. God is here. He is near. And the beauty of God is this, is he desires you to come to him and to pour out and to release your ships to him, to release the baggage, the brokenness, the hurts, the pains that you've walked around far too long with. And he wants to take them. And then he wants to grab your hand and he wants to walk with you in life and show you everything that he has for you. It's beautiful. And I know sometimes as churches and pastors, we try to break down and make this like pretty packaged little bow of like, say this beautiful little prayer and everything's going to be okay. But the reality is like when you accept and walk with Jesus, everything just doesn't become unicorns and rainbows. Life still is hard. But there's comfort knowing that my God is going through it and walking through it with me. I'm not the only one in the fire, the brokenness, the pain, the muck of life anymore. He's with me. And so maybe today you just need to pause. And you need to just pray the prayer of, Jesus, I come before you a sinner. I know that I've sinned against you. But I know and recognize that you, Jesus, you died for my sins. And I ask for your forgiveness for my sins against you, for my lack of devotion, for my lack of faith in moments of life. I ask for your forgiveness, and I ask that you would wipe me clean, wash me clean, and come and fill my life with your spirit and your presence. God, I want to walk with you. So can you give me the endurance? Can you give me your presence and your spirit to do that? I love you, Lord. And pray that in his name, the name that is above all things, the name that spoke things into creation, the name that holds you in his hands, the name of Jesus, the name of the Father and the Spirit, God. That's the beauty of it. When we go all in for him, we know that he's already gone all in for us. God held nothing back. He gave his one and only Son so that we could live with him. Like I said before, God doesn't ask us to do something he himself hasn't done. He risked his life and he died for us. So I want to be willing at any given moment, if he asks me to. Here I am, Lord. Send me.